got it. Divided we fall, net zero, regeneration, and the political economy of climate change. And I'm not sure if Jako was here already when I said, I don't know why we waited so long to present our first climate change continuous learning. This was so overdue, but thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to the people of Botswana who brought this to us. Then a quick overflow. Unfortunately, Mr. Sabati, as I said, is not able to join us, but I will stand in for him just to introduce our two speakers. And without wasting a lot of time, I will hand over to them to take us through and the questions and comments. Jako is a very expert in conversationalist on a webinar, so I'm sure he will take those questions further from the box. May I just say, Dr. Dlamini has made available a series of very interesting videos. We unfortunately do not have time to play all of them. He will be playing one, Vince, who's on the call with us. But the others, we will share the links with you after the event, together with the slides. So, Dr. Clift Lamini, he said, I must only tell you two things about him, and that is he is an alum and that he is CEO of CARDESA. But he's got quite a rich bio, as you can see. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Coordination and Agricultural Research and Development for Southern Africa, CARDESA. It includes 16 SADC countries, he told us. He was also previously the CEO of the Eswatini National Trust Commission in Zambia, technical advisor with World Vision International. He worked at WWF with Table Mountain. He was the manager of the fund. And a research fellow at University Eswatini, etc. He holds his diploma agricultural from UNESCO, honors and PhD from University Stellenbosch, masters in development finance of the business school, MPhil in environmental law, University Cape Town, postgrad certificate in sustainable development from SOAS, University London, and he is currently still studying towards the MSc in Sustainable Development from Sussex. And finalizing executive MBA, Dr. Dlamini is a very, very busy and keen scholar, busy man and keen scholar. Dr. Dlamini is the research fellow with USB as well, pro bono. He's authored over 53 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, books, training manuals, and a series of conference presentations. Dr. Dlamini, we are so delighted to have you with us today, and we really look forward. Before you start, I'm quickly going to introduce our own Dr. Jako Volschenk and then hand over to both of you. Dr. Jako is the senior lecturer and head of MBA program, senior lecturer in strategy and sustainability. Of course, climate change is his key interest. He has worked with a number of South African and global institutions, also the WWF, Netbank, World Bank, and USAID. He consults in the areas of strategy, environmental sustainability, and energy policy. He has furthermore published in areas of competition, energy, sustainability, as well as microfinance. And yeah, in his own time, he regularly participates in cleanup active initiatives. That's very interesting. Jako, Cliff, very heartily welcome to both of you. And with that, I would like to hand over to you and to all participants. Again, welcome those who have just joined us and enjoy this session together with us.
Thanks, Christel.
Thank you.
Cliff and I had a conversation last night and we decided Cliff would go first. Cliff will do a presentation. I think he's the overall expert in the room. I can fill in where I see some areas where I can add some further knowledge. and then we can have a conversation later on. I saw quite a few knowledgeable people on the call as well. So I'm going to switch my camera off and allow Cliff to share his screen. And then after that, we can take it further. Cliff, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the organizers and the Dr. Volschenk. I'm not sure whether the USB will share my screen from that end.
Yes, can I just ask Vince?
Yes.
There we go.
Can it be a bit bigger, because I have a very interesting eyesight. Otherwise, I would just maybe go. I'll just use my.
You can also pull that vertical line on the right side to the right. Then it will increase.
Yes. Can it be increased a little bit?
Is that okay?
I think you'll bear with me. It can't be bigger than this, is it?
On your screen, you can pull that vertical line on the edge, on the right edge. You can pull it to the right. Then it will increase on your screen.
Cliff, I'm not sure if your Zoom screen is maximized on your screen.
Oh.
Maybe just double click on the side of your screen so that it fills your whole screen.
Like this? I think it's okay now.
We can see big.
Oh, I think I would like to thank everybody present in this discussion. I think, to be honest, despite the training and education that I've gained in sustainable development and climate change, I can't call myself an expert yet, because climate change is a very interesting field, which you cannot just call yourself an expert in that one. But we will see how it goes. And the way I'm going to, I think the way we're going to approach it, everyone in the meeting will have the opportunity to share his experiences. My presentation is aimed at triggering a discussion. So it's not like there's someone who is teaching someone. It's not a student-teacher kind of discussion. So I think it will flow in that manner. And I think we're also prepared to learn a lot from the audience. The next slide, please. Yes. I think for me, it's just to highlight the terminologies. We've got just 4 issues, which I think we'll look at. We'll just appreciate what is assumed to be the origins and progress of climate change. And it is clear that what is assumed here may not be the correct assumption, because some people date it back to the late 1800s, some date it back to early 1900s. So this is an open discussion, and people are free to share their experiences, and people are also free to go and read more after this appetizing presentation. We'll look at the global politics of climate change, and then the warming climate in an unequal world. You know, we've got these economic blocks. Africa is different from Asia, for instance. America is different from Europe, you know. So all those aspects. Yet you'll find that the United Nations conventions, they are just binding. Sometimes they then classify the economic blocks or the countries based on their economies, and then it's put in annexures in the conventions. Then we'll look at the political tipping points, and then there'll be a conclusion. I'm not going to be reading the slides word for word in most cases, because I don't want to waste a lot of your time. Next slide, please. So in terms of the definition of climate change, there are 2 definitions that are very close to each other. There's one definition from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's another definition from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The one from the IPCC, it talks about mainly natural contributors to climate change, but it also accommodates anthropocentric, human-related. Then the one on the from the UNFCCC, that one is more about the human activity now, in term when it defines climate change. But at the same time, even that one also alludes to human activity over and above natural causes. So the definitions are almost the same. But I think because the UNFCCC is political, that's why it's just saying human activity altering the climate system. So I think there's a purpose for that. Then there is what we call climate variability. These are the variations. They can be measured statistically over time, over different regions of the world. Then there's the vulnerability. I think when we discussed with Dr. Volschenk yesterday, we talked about this vulnerability. And there are people who think Africa is not vulnerable because Africa is a hot continent. There is nothing that can scare us, even if it can be water. But that is not true. So we'll see how it goes. Then there's the resilience, which is the ability of the social, that is the people, and then the ecological or the ecosystems, to now the climate change impacts. These terminologies are very important. They will even assist us in understanding the whole presentation. Next slide, please. Then in terms of the origins of and progress of climate change, the famous industrial revolution and fossil capital, some scholars have traced it to that. They said when capitalism started, that was the beginning of the end in terms of the climate system. So they think the climate system was actually was disturbed by the overproduction that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. That is where maybe the impact started to be observed quite seriously. Then there is what is called the Great Acceleration, which you can just Google and read about. And this Great Acceleration is actually the time when the USA and other countries said, if you want to meet the growing demand in terms of economy and wealth now, not only subsistence, let's now turn the land or the soil into a manufacturing mechanism for products, instead of now looking at the earth as an ecosystem. So the notion of the earth becoming a tool started then, because it was just production, and overproduction, if I may be brutally honest, is sort of abusing the land or the soil. So the ecosystem functions were lost. They started to be lost, and the ecosystems in certain areas started to collapse. So now, if you want to just appreciate that climate change is a reality, and you want to see some of the causes and effects, you'll just look at a variety of socio-economic trends over many years. The socio-economic trends, I'll just highlight them, you'll see. Then you look at the earth system, because to understand climate change properly, you don't have to come from the political angle. You have to understand people who have studied environmental science, not environmental management, which is an extension of environmental science. They understand climate change better than most of us. So you'll see the earth system, the trends over many years, and you'll see something is happening. You'll just look at them. I'm not going to discuss them. You'll see a lot has happened. Then now, when it comes to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there have been many conference of parties, dialogues going on over many years. They talk about the emission gap. How can you start you can just appreciate how can we start to close the gap, but there are some controversies which are delaying progress even in that regard. Then the global greenhouse gas emissions, they were supposed to peak in 2020, and the gap must be closed by 2030. That was what the world wished for. Then in terms of the impacts of climate change, you see the flooding, you see the drought, the extreme temperatures, the short rainfalls, a lot of other natural disasters, which are now sort of natural / man-made. Next slide, please. Then I talked about the great acceleration. What happened then? Now my eyesight is giving me some problem. But here it's all about when the great acceleration started, and some of the people that were involved, including a certain president of the United Nations, of the United States rather. So the United States has always been looked at as a superpower. So if they also supported the great acceleration, you would assume that a lot of other continents follow suited. And then that is when production went beyond the capacity of most of the ecosystems. Next slide, please. I think the slides will be made available for you to read on spare time as well. So now when you look at the socio-economic trends, these socio-economic trends are easy to understand. I think most of us here have had the opportunity to read about them. You will know that between the time stretch stated here, where the world population has increased drastically. Real GDP has increased, foreign direct investment, the urban population, even in the small countries like Eswatini, Lesotho, Botswana, and so on, you'll find that the urban population 20 years ago was not as big as it is now. So that has an effect on climate change as well, directly or indirectly. Then primary energy use, fertilizer consumption. Most of the input subsidies are chemical fertilizer based, and then the consumption, even production. Most of the policies, they promote production, and that is now in industrial agriculture, for instance, and they forget about this agroecology where there's limited chemicals. So you see what is happening. As much as we're fighting against climate change, we're also exacerbating climate change because we're not changing our policies. Large dams, we used to have very few, but now there are so many. Water use, it's also linked to many other factors here. The population, the production systems, paper production, transportation, the transport industry. Maybe that some of the transportation, some of the dealers, especially automobiles, they are trying to then come with innovation to reduce emissions. International tourism, you know, had it not been for the prevailing COVID, tourism has been soaring over the years. Next slide, please. Then this one is more related to science now. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, I think you know how much it has increased over the years. Nitrous oxide, methane, which is also from agriculture itself. There's a lot of methane. Now there's the loss of the stratospheric ozone. But I think the stratospheric ozone, I think since the world started to attend to it, now I think there's improvement. But then surface temperature has increased, acidification of this ocean, you know, marine fish capture, you see the quantities of fish, even the diversity of fish. You will see that there's the difference. Coastal nitrogen, the forest loss, you know, we have different types of forests across the regions, and we are losing forests at an alarming rate to many factors. We are losing species to climate change. We are losing a lot in terms of our forest ecosystems as well. We may be doing afforestation and reforestation, but that cannot bring back the natural ecosystems. There is more domesticated land now than before. The terrestrial biosphere degradation now is rampant. So these are the things you look at, and then you see climate change is real. Next slide, please. Then when now we get into the politics of climate change, you find that there are some contested politics to the response to climate change. I think in the meeting with people who have participated in this, you find that there is a question, who is responsible for addressing climate change? Which institutions are responsible? What technology and markets are there? Now we have carbon markets and others, though we know some of the countries that are suffering from the impacts of climate change, mainly from industrialized countries, they don't have the technology. Now, when it comes to the institutions and technology, that requires a lot of funding. That is why you'll find that Africa, to be relevant to where we are now, was struggling completely to address climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation, because we don't have the relevant institutions. We don't have the relevant technology. Whose responsibility? I think this one is because it is well known and documented. It's an open secret that industrialized countries are responsible for most of the climate change and the impacts thereof. So this global politics, these issues are discussed there. But the unfortunate thing is that most of the African negotiators are not well equipped with the knowledge and the skills to negotiate. Because you find that a person is a negotiator, but he doesn't understand climate change completely. He doesn't understand the climate systems, the evolution of climate change. So, but I'm happy that there's a certain expert who's helping UN to develop some training modules for preparing African negotiators, especially the youth. So he's equipping them. Next slide, please. The other complication when it comes to climate change is because, as you see this slide, all these institutions and organizations are all trying to deal with climate change, and they are doing it simultaneously. Some of them are disconnected, though some of them may connect at one point. So now you can imagine that if there are so many, and some of them are not even captured in this picture, if there are so many people, institutions dealing with this climate change is straightforward. It's just, as per the definition, it's clear what it is. But then you have so many institutions which are not well coordinated. What do you expect? There is going to be very limited progress. And over and above limited progress, there'll be differing views, even on the approaches to address climate change. So that is the essence of this slide. Next slide, please. Then here is just to appreciate that the climate is warming, but we're in an equal world. Climate change has brought a lot of conflicts. Even within a country, for instance, or within a region, there are some inequalities. Then there will be conflicts. There will be economic injustice, inequality, eco-colonialism, and pulling up the development ladder, population versus consumption. Those conflicts are there. And interestingly, I think there are very few countries of the world that are aiming to tackle population explosion or population growth. I think it's a sensitive issue, but it's an issue which is vital for climate change. You cannot address climate change if you don't discuss how population can be controlled. Then there is climate injustice, unequal contributions, because they are industrialized, non-industrialized, developed, developing countries in transition, and the impact are different. So there's this injustices that there are some climate justice associations that are erupting now, maybe from the civil society in most cases, to get into the dialogue and then try to influence climate change discussions. Then the evolving North-South politics, the North being countries like Europe, the US, and other first world countries. There are some politics even there. Even during the negotiations, there are some differences in terms of you guys are responsible for this. Africa, for instance, Africa could be responsible for most of the climate change of the greenhouse gas emissions, because Africa is rich with minerals, but and even agriculture. But because we're not processing, we're exporting raw material. That's why at the moment we think we're not responsible for this. Because the people in the industrialized countries are normally processing our African raw material. Then this climate change comes in into the play. So I think even when we discuss, we have to appreciate a lot of other trade-offs there. Next slide, please. I think this is the last point before the conclusion. So now when it comes to political tipping points, these are the issues that if you listen to some of the videos, then you'll see that now we are reaching a point where it's difficult because the world is dominated by rich people, by rich countries. But as long as we seek wealth, it means we are going to make climate change worse. So that's when you get the political tipping points. There are declining prices of oil. There is the cost competitive solar, the climate regimes I talked about, then the reduction in fossil fuel subsidies, climate justice movements. This is just a culmination of the discussion, the discussions I've done, the presentation I've done before. Then constructing alternatives. I think when I was working with WWF, the offices were occupying, they were already now trying to address climate change and carbon emissions. They were not just ordinary offices there at Kirsten Botanic Gardens. Then shareholder activism. Some people, they strategically buy shares in companies just to come in the board meetings and influence the discourse of climate change, how the companies should behave. Then the investor perceptions. There are some, because of investor perceptions, because of the influence from these climate activists, some of the investors now are changing their perceptions. Some people do not buy products that have not been produced sustainably. Products, the way we find that, like producing electricity from coal, for instance, is not an option that some investors are interested in. I think this is now the last slide. They are going for the last one, please. Then in conclusion, I think I can summarize this slide by saying climate change requires systemic change. Because we're talking about a climate system with many different parts. So it means the solution is supposed to consider that we're dealing with a system. The climate system is affected by what is going on, has been going on for many years. So you cannot approach climate change without really addressing the whole system, the whole part. So that is the approach. So global action, maybe that is why we have this convention, which cascades to regional protocols, then into national strategies. We have now climate change, national climate change policies, and so on and so forth. So that is the approach. I think now what we can note here, with the international agreements and the disagreements between the North and the South, it has become very difficult to address climate change. So it means the North and the South have to converge. They have to come to a round table, but before the South attends the round table, they have to have sufficient capacity to participate meaningfully on the round table. Because if you are on the round table to add numbers and you don't understand issues, it doesn't serve the purpose. So I think the take-home question is, what can Southern Africa specifically, or Africa in general, do towards the issue of combating climate change? Having heard the presentation, how it went, I think there are so many other climate change websites, many definitions over and above the IPCC and the UNFCCC. You know, people craft these definitions all the time, but for the sake of this presentation and for us to remain relevant to what is obtaining globally, regionally, and nationally in most cases, I thought if we just stick to the two definitions, which are also very related. Thank you very much for listening. Now I think I'll hand over to Dr. Volschenk, but what we discussed, there are a few points, is going to just make us think about how are the different economic blocks reacting to these climate change impacts? Because the world is becoming worse in terms of the climate change impacts. Then how is Africa vulnerable to climate change? I think we have to demystify the fact that we're Africans and we are used to scorching heat and we don't care about climate change. That is not correct, to be honest, but it will depend how this discussion goes. Then the most important issue, which becomes now a challenge, because you talk about economic growth every day and end up prioritizing sectors wrongly. The environmental sector is number last, but you talk about economic growth, yet the environmental sector is the one which now supports the economic growth. Even agriculture and other industries are supported by the environment, the ecosystems, but they are, in terms of priorities, they are number last. So how do you maintain economic growth while respecting the earth? Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Volschenk.
Thanks, Cliff. I've asked in the chat some questions, and I encourage the people online, because I'm aware this is an alumni session and we would like to also hear some voices from alumni and involve them in the conversation. So Tracy Bailey asked the question. She said, Cliff, with regard to your observations about the limitations to Africa's negotiation capacity, how do you think this is likely to play out at the upcoming COP26? Now, this is always, does Africa have any power in these kind of conversations? What is your view on that? And how can Africa possibly increase the power that we have?
I think what I've read about, I've seen the latest publications coming out of the synthesis of the latest IPCC report. There's something which was a bit disturbing, which said climate change policies or climate policies have utterly failed to address climate change. African negotiators always engage in the climate negotiations with the intention to develop climate change policies. And we have developed climate change policies over the years. But the IPCC, which is independent, they just said, so far, the climate policies that are resulting from the negotiations have dismally failed. So I think it's unfortunate that the African negotiators, some of them are not aware of what I'm talking about, that the climate policies have failed so far. If they knew that, they were going to negotiate differently. But going to the next COP, still our negotiators are not capacitated enough. I was fortunate to be requested to just briefly review. I think 4 training modules meant for the negotiators, African negotiators, the youth category. And at least in those training modules, they are up to speed about what is happening in terms of climate change over the years. So I think capacity building, even though it has become a monotonous concept, but it's important. You cannot negotiate if you don't have the knowledge and the skill. Some of the negotiators, I know some of them, but I still maintain capacity building will help us. We have to understand the issue and how it has evolved over many years. You have to also have just a basic understanding of the science of the climate. Thank you.
To what extent, and I mean, I want to extend on that question. To what extent, is Africa still stuck with a minority complex, if I can put it that way? We go to these and we said, the developed world, they're so much ahead of us. Their universities are, even when people go study, they want to study at international universities. At what point will Africa take leadership here? And do you think Africa is capable of taking leadership? I mean, we are probably, in terms of climate change, one of the most vulnerable continents out there. And why is it that we don't see more leadership from Africa in this regard?
Throwing that one to the floor or to me? Or I can start and then throw it to the floor?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. Let's do that.
Yes, I think when I look at the evolution of climate change, I think climate change has been hijacked by politics completely, because some of the decisions that come out of the COPs, you can see that there is no scientific evidence. It's just some decisions are emotive there. So I think unless there are think tanks and scientists have a voice and are represented in the negotiations. Yesterday, I was in another workshop I was presenting on climate change related Paris Agreement. I told them that the scientists, they're not normally represented in the negotiations. To me, the absence of such people and the local communities, because the local communities have got indigenous knowledge on how they have been dealing with some of the what I would call environment change. Environment change over many years is related to climate change now. Those people are not represented, so it becomes very difficult. Maybe I can throw it back to the floor then.
Let's do that. I see Kagiso's hand is up. Kagiso, would you like to contribute to that, or you have a question?
No, I would like to contribute. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to agree with Dr. Dlamini here in terms of the political interference, because if you look at what's going on around the world today, politics are sort of ruling everything, and science is being relegated to the back. Even if you try to speak against the politicians, that very particular scientist is seen as crazy or something like that. So the points that he raised, capitalism and politics, they are the greatest obstacles for addressing this issue of climate change, because people are driven by gain and by power rather than looking at what's going on around the world today.
Thank you, Kagiso. I think that's a good contribution. I think you're right. You know, in fact, one of the aspects that I would have liked to touch on, and maybe Cliff or someone else can contribute to this as well, but there's just the aspect of misinformation. And Kagiso, alluded to that I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that the most popular piece of news about climate change was one that showed that, 3,500 climate scientists, he just said, scientists disagree with the science of climate change. And that was splattered over social media everywhere. And, lots of my friends said, oh, Yaku, what have you got to say now? And then a follow-up study was done about that. And they asked the data of those 3,500. And it turned out that none of the 3,500 were actually climate scientists. They were food science, meat science, industrial science, whatever science, but they weren't climate scientists. And in return, they then just had the view. And there's absolute consensus around climate scientists about where climate change is coming from. So, quite often when you are in these debates, you have people making irrelevant statements and quoting research that is false research or funded by, interested companies that whose interest it is not to support the science about climate change. I'm not sure, Cliff, if you would like to add anything there.
I think what I've observed, there's a time when I was a research fellow in climate change and natural resources in Zambia. What I observed, there are a lot of people who back business cards where you write Clift Lamini, climate change consultant, climate change expert. There were so many people like that, and there are so many people like that even now. But you find that the person is empty when it comes to climate science itself. The person is empty when it comes to environmental science, not environmental management, which is an application of environmental science. I often have a problem when someone comes with a qualification in environmental management when they've not done environmental science. They are bound to falter, those people anyway. I'm sorry to say that. But back to the point here, I think most of the people in the negotiations are not climate scientists at all. That is why what comes out of that will not work. in resolving climate change crisis. As long as you come up with the wrong solution, it will not work. That is the problem that is happening now. Africans are not selecting qualified and competent people in climate science to represent them in the negotiations. And the politicians, which are backed by the big business people who are rich, those rich people, it's all about profits, all about wealth. So they don't want to understand when you negotiate and you want to stop overproduction. So that is the problem.
Thanks, Cliff. Mabasu asked a question here, and I want to link this with another question. How should we address the gap between the rhetoric and action on climate change? And it very much is related to what we're saying now, because there's plenty, everyone's saying we should, and even at an intergovernmental level, we're saying, yes, we should do something about climate change, absolutely. But when it comes to action, nothing happens. Now, Johan Forster posted a question also about TCFD, which is kind of the task force for financial industry to disclose their involvement with climate change. But he says the TCFD pressures on industrial strategy is challenging in local support and in CapEx funding. So, where, from a policy point of view, where should the pressure come from? Information-based policies doesn't work. We tell people climate change is happening, and then someone throws in some doubt in there, and then nothing happens. Financial strategies, we tried with carbon financing, that didn't seem to have been working. We're looking at directive-based policies in the Paris Agreement, where we say, well, everyone should now reduce, and still it's not happening. So what is in your view, and this is a very, very difficult question, because obviously, but in your view, which direction is next? Where should we be going with making a difference?
It's unfortunate. There's a slide which I have. There are two slides which I have, but they're not part of my presentation. These slides.
I'm gonna quickly call them up, Cliff. So keep talking. I'll bring it in.
So those two slides are actually just outlining the reasons behind why the world is refusing to change, and maybe why the world is changing. Those slides were just looking at that, and some countries are named there. So maybe yes. The first one, yes. The first one is saying forces of inertia and forces of change. Inertia being the people are refusing to change. Not only people, but countries and the giants, business people. So this one is just, what are the forces? Forces for change. But I think this one is the second one. There's the first one.
Okay.
Yeah. Forces, why is it difficult? What is the stumbling block? Then here I just outlined major fuel exporters are a stumbling block. You look at Russia, look at Saudi Arabia. If those are major fuel exporters, which side of the fence do you think they're standing? That is then large domestic fuel sources for electricity generation. For instance, you go to Poland and Indonesia. That is another one. Then there is just denial about global warming. For example, in certain parts of the US, the same denial that is going on about the COVID vaccination anyway. Then there is falling energy demand. That's another problem, which means a less urgent requirement for the new capital stock. For example, much of Europe is there. So you see the countries that are listed here, which are forces of inertia, how powerful they are. Then here, the high cost of capital, that is Africa. Africa is also part of the stumbling blocks now. It appears here. Then high renewable costs. For example, Japan, Then high levels of corruption. I don't want to talk about corruption. When you look at the corruption perception index, you will see where we rank on the continent. But then at the same time, we also have to look at who is sponsoring the corruption. Then you see we are not alone. Then the fact that the industrial sector, I can see now, is tied into the fossil fuel system. So you see, the Japanese, then the limited amount of renewable energy capacity, for example, the Vatican. So now, when you look at the forces of inertia, stumbling blocks, they are here, they are clear. So if you try to learn more on these forces of inertia, stumbling blocks, now stopping progress towards addressing the change, you see? Then now there are some forces of change.
Can I maybe just interrupt you there, Dr. Dlamini? I mean, in my conversations, often in the classroom, as well as, you know, not just at Stellenbosch, but at other institutions as well. Even at USAID, you sometimes come across these where people say, but, you know, Africa, if you look at the global footprint, we actually don't have such a huge footprint. Yes, South Africa has, but the rest of Africa, very, very minute footprint. If you look at the energy capacities in countries, you know, name them, Kenya, Namibia, Botswana, any of those. Can we really do anything in Africa about climate change? I mean, is that not also a form of inertia? People saying, but we're more vulnerable to climate change than we are actually responsible for climate change. What is your view on that?
When it comes to the politics of climate change, you will find that the countries that are not entirely, they are not fully responsible, the ones that are contributing very little are the ones which are most vulnerable. More particularly because climate change response strategies are mainly, they're just all about a lot of money that is finance and high tech. So Africa is affected more than all the continents, but we don't have the appropriate technology. We don't have the appropriate financial muscle to deal with climate change impacts. So just a simple thing, I think in some overseas countries, you find that when it is extremely hot in the schools, the kids will be wearing hats, for instance. They'll be having maybe sunscreen or other things. Those small things, most African schools can't afford those things. There are so many things, even at micro level, when you talk of microclimate amelioration. But at least in Africa, sometimes in the rural areas, we are blessed with microclimate amelioration, because when it is too hot, the head boy or whosoever will just run and sit under a tree or stand under a tree. Then it's cooler there. So you see, we don't have the money, we don't have the technology, and it's going to take years until we reach that level. I don't know how it can be, because climate, as I said, climate change is synonymous with the climate system. So if there are impacts, they don't say because they were generated in Europe, they are going to be just focusing on Europe. They just focus on the whole system, so that we are on the receiving end of something that we are not responsible for, because it's a system. That is why sometimes I think with a loud voice, the industrialized countries should be putting more effort and finances into climate change. Thank you.
On that same note, you know, Africa is fairly underdeveloped. So we spoke about this in the past few days. When you talk about economic growth, we still want to grow a lot, but the rest of the world saying, but you can't be allowed to grow that much, because we just can't allow more coal to be dug out of the soil. What is your view on that, the link between economic growth and climate change, and how can that link possibly be broken?
I think the long-term implication, when you look at the processes and the direction from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and most of there's a report called The Future We Want that came out sometime in one of the COPs. When you read with understanding what the document are saying, they are literally saying those countries that are not yet industrialized may not be industrialized. So I think now it's very difficult for Africa to industrialize. When you look at the demands of the multilateral agreements. So it means even when you try to, establish an industry, the comprehensive mitigation plan for you to reduce emissions is more expensive. It means the industry will run at a loss. I think that is what I've observed. You may industrialize and seek to improve economic growth. At the same time, if you fully comply with the comprehensive mitigation plan associated with the environmental impact assessment for establishing that industry, you'll find that you run at a loss. And Africa cannot afford to run at a loss because we are already at a loss as a continent. Yes.
Thank you. I see Francois Hasbrook, your hand's up. Would you like to contribute?
Also Cliff, Jako, great conversation so far. Sorry, I joined a little bit late, so
Sure.
What I'm asking might have already been addressed. Cliff, you mentioned there about, I mean, especially from a resource point of view, that Africa is not exactly a resource in terms of capital rich, quote unquote, and that our potential to address things like climate change is hampered by that. But there is a bit of a dichotomy in that argument, because a country like, for instance, China and the USA has got no shortage of capital, but absolutely no political will to address it. So I don't quite think that we should stare ourselves into a brick wall, that if we don't have free cash, for lack of a better description, then we can't address climate change. In the same breath, I mean, should we not be looking at case studies like, why is it that Scandinavian countries in general are so much more advanced on this conversation than everyone else? And my only, I mean, brief synopsis would be it's a cultural thing. And political will is driven by the people, and the people are driven by their cultural zeitgeist and beliefs of a day. And as a whole, they believe their responsibility lies in the future. But in terms, let's discuss Africa. Is part of our challenge not to say, but if we want to, and we have to grow economically, but also be responsible and also be kind of take note of the fact that the industrialized and first world nations are always going to play the card. But yeah, sorry guys, you're 200 years behind the curve, but we only got one Earth, so you just got to suck it up and deal with the fact that you can't have carbon emissions. Of saying, why don't we focus on developing our intellectual capital rather than industrial capital, being completely focused on the resource curse of we have to dig coal to grow, we have to burn things and build things to grow, and say, what about intellectual growth? What about the world economy, in my opinion, is moving towards services, not manufacturing anymore. Is that not part of, I mean, twofold? One, the Scandinavian question of culture, and secondly, growing our economy through services and intellectual capital, rather than being completely singularly focused on manufacturing and building and digging and burning, so to speak. Yeah, that's my bit. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think I think the trend that you are talking about is one of the best that could be adopted. But I think I know only one country which is now moving in that direction. There's one country in East Africa which is moving in that direction, where they have now looked at science, innovation. Is it science, technology, and innovation for economic growth? There's one country which I may not mention here, which has already adopted that. But when you look at the Human Development Index and the human capital on the continent, that's an issue which needs some attention as well. Because you will find that people have got they've got tons and tons of certificates and degrees and whatever, and you only to find that those people cannot think. It happens. So the human capital determinants, I think we first have to change the perception towards understanding the human development index, because that one is misleading us. You find countries with a high human development index in the region, for instance, in the SADC region, but they're not doing well in terms of using that human capital to advance in terms of economic growth. So I think even our perception of human development index should change slightly. But there is a country which is already, and it's moving well in many approaches. Even their agriculture sector adopted a certain model called the commercial village model, you know, and they are doing well. So I think what we have to have mentioned is an issue which, if our negotiators would have someone like you on the table when they go and attend the negotiations, it would change the dynamic. But as we said maybe before you came, the people who are engaged in the negotiations are not people like yourself. They are people who are just there to negotiate about things that they don't fully understand. They don't have a foresight about certain situations, especially emanating from climate change. Thank you. Maybe Jako and the team in the meeting can add.
Cliff, I'm with you on that. I think, well, you know, I think there's great opportunity in climate change as well. And we've been focusing now a lot on the risk side and why are things not happening. And what I would like to do is move the conversation slightly towards more that, let's call it the positive psychology side. And I think the students that know my classes would know that I talk a lot about this. So I'm gonna share your second slide, because I want to move the conversation to what are the drivers of change? Why are things changing? And maybe, you know, tie in with that, the opportunity that climate change holds for Africa to step forth and be a leader. So let me first share your slide, and then you can talk from the slide, and then we can take it from there. For the forces for change, yeah. Oh, you on mute, Cliff.
Sorry about that. No, then this slide now is looking at forces for change in the umbrella of sustainable development, looking at the political economy of climate change. Major importers of fossil fuel, for example, in small island developing countries. The major importers, if the major importers strike and say they are on a go slow, they are not going to import fossil fuel, they are now seeking alternatives. That can change the dynamic in terms of the amount of fossil fuel in circulation. That will automatically cut down the emissions. Then limited domestic sources of fossil fuel for electricity, like in Spain. In Spain, there are limited sources. So automatically, if the sources are limited, it means the emissions are limited. Then high levels of domestic pollution, for example, in India. If there are high levels of pollution, then this is a force of change. High level, a well-informed public with concerns about global warming. For example, in Norway, we talked about the Scandinavian countries. They are a cut above the rest. Australia is also amongst that group. Australia is doing well, very well in terms of change. Then low and rising energy demand. Vietnam, for instance, is a force. Then enough wealth to finance the capital cost of the energy transition. For example, in Norway again. Then large low-cost renewable sources in Chile, for instance. Large low-cost renewable energy in Chile. You see? That is a force for change, changing from fossil fuel to renewable energy. Then governments that want to lead in new areas of technology. For example, in China. China is massive. If now they want to lead in new areas in technology, they are a force for change. Then governments that are concerned about energy security, for example, in Germany. So you see, when you look at the points here in the countries mentioned, you can see that these are real forces for change. Like in the other slide where you could see the real change forces for just stubbornness and inertia. So I think now we can also make this slide available. Members in the meeting can also just pick areas of interest and say, when you talk about limited domestic source of fossil fuels for electricity generation, for example, in Spain, what does that entail? So I think through ESP, both the presentations can be circulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. I'm not sure if there are any points on this that anyone would like to make in the conversation. I know a few people are leaving and I don't want to cut people out of the conversation. It's really interesting to me. I'm sure you can see I love the conversation, but if there are anyone that would like to unmute, ask a direct question or contribute to this particular thing, to what extent can the movement towards lower carbon economies be an opportunity for Africa? Maybe I can, if no one's going to comment on this, I think it was Elon Musk that recently made a point about, and you made the point, Cliff, about Chile being in a position of really having very low energy prices. And to a large extent, those low energy prices come from the fact that you've got in Chile a very, well, actually that's also in Mexico the case, very thin line of country with high differences in wind speeds, and that causes wind and a lot of wind power. Africa, Namibia, South Africa, we've got some of the best solar resources in the world. So to what extent is this a pipe dream? If we say, we become the exporters of hydrogen or the exporters of power directly, to what extent do you think Africa is in a position to do that?
I'm sorry, Jako, I was interrupted. What was this?
My point was about, Elon Musk recently said Africa should become the main exporter of energy to the world because we've got the best sunshine, we've got incredible wind resources. You mentioned Chile that has really good wind energy as well. To what extent do you think is Africa in a position to leverage this opportunity to become the leading exporter of energy? We're not a technology leader. You mentioned in China as probably the biggest producer of photovoltaic panels in the world, and there's no way that Africa would be able to compete on that. And Africa and South Africa have tried that. It's not going to happen. But the question to you is, to what extent do you think can Africa in the next 10 to 20 years take up that position of an energy exporter?
I think as we're discussing a science issue, which is also interconnected to politics, I think if the idea that you are trying to explore from the Chile experience, if that can be shared with the relevant structures at national level, for instance, or even at regional level, because there is the national level, then the same people converge at the regional level to influence the global. If the politicians can be made to understand the potential, I'm not sure if there is a platform where people who are who think like yourselves, like the scientists, economists, natural resource scientists, whatever, environmental. I don't know if there's a platform where they converge and sit on the same table to share their evidence-based ideas and their visions with the executive, for instance, with the judiciary, for instance, with the legislature, for instance. Because if these ideas, these novel ideas, if we find a platform where we can sit with the ministers, maybe separate from the parliamentarians and separate from the people who are now will be controlling in terms of the legal framework, the judiciary, and make them understand and appreciate this. I think then we can, once we get the political will, it's possible to move forward. But at the moment, there is no platform where scientists will meet these structures of governance in most cases. I've never seen that platform, but if that platform can be created, some of the politicians are naturally intelligent. They will run with these ideas. But now there's a disconnect between scientists and those people who are influential. Thank you.
I think I'm going to go directly into the next point, and I like what you said just now about, you know, sitting around the same table, because you mentioned to me in one of our conversations that the private sector is often absent from these conversations. What is your view? In which way can private sector? Because, you know, we don't trust politicians much, but I wouldn't say we trust capitalists much more. How do we bring private sector into the conversation without causing bribery and corruption? Well, I guess we have some of that already, but maybe just your view on the role of private sector in this negotiation stage.
What I've observed over the years, let me just talk about the forestry sector. In the forestry sector, the private sector is doing better, is doing well compared to government or the public sector, simply because there are some regulations, there are some market-related mechanisms. If you don't produce timber, for instance, from sustainable sources, your products may not be accepted. So the market plays a big role in transforming the private sector to perform better than even the public sector in certain issues. So the presence of the private sector is very key, because already they are not controlled nationally or internally. They are controlled, maybe sometimes if they export their products, they are controlled by that market. So the private sector is very critical. Even when it comes to product in agriculture commodities, most of the products from the private sector are premium because the quality is determined by the markets. So the markets are synonymous with the private sector. So the private sector is very critical in the discussions. When it comes to total quality control, the private sector can really assist there.
Thank you, Cliff. Maybe in the back of your mind, you can think of one or two questions so long to ask our audience, but maybe I would like to ask you, one of the things which I've heard Jonathan Porritt, one of the British politicians and also an economist, talk about the role of population. And I know you and I also spoke about this. To what extent is population growth a problem? To what extent can we mitigate climate change into the future with population control? You know, population is not going to happen fast. People that are born today will be with us for the next probably 100 to 120 years. But how do you see that going forward, population growth?
I think where I sit, I'm already a very stressed person, because I am one person who is aware that with the current population of the world, for any meaningful sustainability going forward, already we need 1.5 the size of the current planet to survive at the moment. So now, when it comes to population growth, actually, if it was possible, we were supposed to cut down the current population to the carrying capacity of the planet. But for ethical reasons, we can't do that. So already we have a problem of overpopulation. The population has hit a level where we need 1.5 times the present planet or the Earth that we have. So it means now, in terms of population policies, the world has to be vigilant. I don't know how, because some countries are very sensitive. in terms of population. But population policies are they are just one aspect which remains very critical, because actually there's a document which I read and I actually believed it, because I read it in connection with other documents on sustainable development. I think the ecosystem started to collapse in the early 70s. They continue to collapse. So now the population is more than an urgent issue that needs to be addressed, because we already have more than enough for the current capacity of the planet, even in terms of production, in terms of consumption, and otherwise. So I don't know how this population issue can be addressed. Is another issue which is very serious.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned from the 1970s, and similar to you, I've also seen some statistics, and the world population has doubled since the 1970 or since 1970. That's roughly when I was born. In that period, the world's population has doubled. The consumption of meat in that same period has tripled. And this goes against what we think. We think, oh, we're all more environmentally responsible, we're all more environmentally aware. But with reducing poverty, people also upgrade to their diets to include more protein. And that creates a problem. So population is one side of the coin, but on the other side, there's consumption and there's wealth and how people spend their money. How do we change mindsets? Because I think someone else, and I think it may have been Francois, that also referred to the role of individuals. There's the political argument. There's what happens at the COPs, the Conference of Parties of the UN. How do we convince the normal man on the street to change when everyone feels, but I can't make a difference alone? Maybe you can give us some examples from forestry, deforestation in Africa. How do you change behavior?
I think the forestry sector is the one which is riddled with the most corruption. That is why there's no United Nations Convention on forests up to now. Because sovereignty says we don't want the world to interfere to our forests, because there's a lot of corruption and people are gaining from this corruption, especially because most of our governments are corrupt. So that one is an issue which is difficult to deal with. But changing the mindset of individuals isn't. I think that if you start changing the mindset from a household level to a community level, then to the national level, I think that one would be. Then from there, like we see, there are some positive deviants, like countries that are now doing well in the region. Then you take them as examples and you follow them. I think I think change has to start from the household, the unit level. Then it has to diffuse accordingly. I think that is another important issue. The change diffusing from the individual level. If, like for instance, let me just give an example about this COVID-19 vaccine. If myself as a major stakeholder in my household, I rejected the vaccine, the chances that my children will accept it are very low. So it means the heads of the households or the major stakeholders, their mindset has to change first, because the guys with influence, if you change the people with influence, influential people they have an infectious character. If those are targeted and then the change starts there, for me, I think it would be important. So in a society or in a country, you know which positions and which structures are influential. You go directly there and try to bring some sense there. I remember when we had WWF, I think the Prince Edward Island was the most difficult island to be declared a protected area. But because the WWF expert targeted the most influential people around the issue, at one point it was accepted, and that island was now declared a protected area. So negotiations, not forcing people, because when you negotiate and ask people to volunteer to do something is better than when you come with hard law. So you target the most influential, you talk to them. It's a process, it can't be overnight. Then I think that is the best approach.
Thank you, Cliff. I think I agree with you there. You know, at household level is where the change should happen. A lot of the research around environmental mindsets and change actually shows that the best place to start is with children. I mean, I know all the pictures are behind you against your wall of your kids, but children are much more open to new ideas and to understand that there's a problem and that they can change that problem. And when our children tell us and hold us responsible, I think our behavior change as well. The last question I have for you is related to universities and the role of business schools. Now, Stellenbosch University just recently started the School for Climate Change, which is actually a faculty on its own, only focused on climate change. To what extent can business schools play a role? You know, historically speaking, we are the custodians of capitalism. We are responsible for economic growth. Yes, Stellenbosch University and the USB is for responsible leadership. So these kind of debates is a core of our value proposition, and we want to create ethical growth, sustainable growth, etc. How do you see the role of business schools? Should we become more active in climate change, or should we tone it down? Where's that balance that we should have?
I'll just make an example about myself. I'm completing my MSc in Sustainable Development with the University of Sussex in UK. And the MSc in Sustainable Development is offered by the business school of the University of Sussex. So it means the university has already seen it proper that the sustainable development is now integrated into the syllabus or curriculum of the business school, into the programs offered there. So the moment you dissociate the sustainable development, because most of the climate change is studied under sustainable development. When I did a bit of sustainable development with the University of London, I found that the business school is supposed to be the custodian, because the moment you dissociate the two, then it means you are going to have businesses that are not sustainable. So I hope, even with Stellenbosch University, the business school will have a very good rapport with the School of Climate Change or Climate Science. The business school should be the custodian of sustainable development studies, which include climate change, yes.
Thanks, Cliff. I think there are a number of instances at the university that they are playing. In fact, there is an MPhil in sustainability. There's a master's degree in renewable energy at Stellenbosch. So I think there are ample examples, but thanks for the examples you gave us as well. I think in conclusion, maybe I can ask you to make a closing statement, then I can make a closing statement, and then we can give back to Christelle in order to finish by 2:30.
Thank you very much. I wish the same discussion can be extended through the people that are present today to other fora or other forums. Because to me, sustainable development and climate change are Siamese twins. They can't be separated. And the world, when you look at Agenda 2030, it's about sustainable development. It's about climate change and development. It's about economic growth and so on. So I wish to implore our participants or members here to share the information with their colleagues. And I think Dr. Volschenk and myself remain available to engage further through emails or other platforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. I think those are good words. I think my last statement would be, I often have the conversation, and conversations like these make me sometimes a bit depressed, because I think, the mountain we have to climb is so big, and it always, and the students that are in my class would know that I always have the conversation about the 4 virtues and what is it that we want from future generations. And there are 4 things, and that's what I would like to leave in this conversation. The first is wisdom, the ability to notice what is right. And that goes with awareness, that if you don't know the truth, get to the truth. Do enough research and don't stop until you are convinced of what the truth is. Secondly, responsibility. And responsibility, as Arnold Smith would say, spells out responsibility, the ability to respond. And it is our ability. If you have the ability to respond, you have a responsibility. So that's the second thing. Thirdly is prudence. The ability to be happy with what you have, to not overconsume, to not keep on wanting indefinitely. And then lastly, and this is the most important one for me in this conversation, is courage. That we step into the shoes of the world and that we do something, that we act. And to go to some of the questions that were there, you know, how do we move past the inertia and go into action? And it is up to us eventually to act and to do the things that needs doing. Christelle, over to you. Thank you very much. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I just had to write those 4 words down. I think that's a most absolute spot on summary for the end and for wisdom for us as well. Cliff, Dr. Cliff, Jako, this was an amazing conversation. One of the best that I've heard, maybe because I don't know so much about the subject, but this was an amazing conversation. Thank you very much for your really insightful presentation, Cliff. It's really got the people going. This must have been one of the most active conversations in the chat that we've had. With that, I would also like to thank our Botswana group for putting this together for us, to coming to us with this proposal. And then to all our participants, I know many had to leave. We don't always have such a long session, but the topic warranted this today. Thank you all for your very excellent participation and for the proposal here by Tracy. I'm looking at. I also want to say to Baitsi Pudisi from CARDESA. He's put something in the chat that is very valuable under the banner of the program, partnership with other sub-regional organizations working together on a to rally stakeholders. We hope we are one of those stakeholders. We hope we can work in future with you, with CARDESA, on a range of things. With the USB, we really value the possibility of such a partnership. And then lastly, also a Tracy Bailey taking us with her comment to the future for a possible future event. She says it would be great to have a session where folks can brainstorm all the ways in which Africa can either leverage existing advantages, as Jako explained, and to become progressive global actors. I think that's good. It's really something to take us forward into a next conversation. And we welcome everybody that were present today and all our other friends out there to join us in the next round. Thank you for keeping our flag high up, alumni, both of you. And for the ones organizing it, we really, truly value our alumni participation and to see where you are in the world and the huge contributions and impact you are making in the world out there. Thank you very much from us. Until next time. Next time is Thursday, actually. Thank you. Next time is Thursday. If you want to join us for Vintage 41, you can look on our website and alumni events. That's also a very interesting one coming up on wine. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.